The desert night is heavy with silence, broken only by the hiss of shifting sand. In the faint light of a torch, shadows dance across sandstone walls etched with hieroglyphs of gods, kings, and judgment. But beneath the grandeur of pyramids and temples lies a truth far darker than their golden myths, a justice system so merciless it could make the heart of even the strongest man falter. In ancient Egypt, crime was not simply disobedience, it was chaos. And chaos, to them, was treason against the gods themselves. Punishment was not about correction. It was about spectacle. It wasn't a lesson, it was a warning. It wasn't rehabilitation, it was ritualized terror, from branding criminals with red-hot to burying the guilty alive in the very sands that birthed their civilization. The Egyptians believed that only pain could restore order. Their methods were not just punishments, they were performances, designed to etch fear into every bystander who dared to watch. But what drove a society that worshipped gods of harmony, truth, and balance to create punishments so brutal, so theatrical, that even their enemies were shocked? This is not the Egypt of glossy museum exhibits or school textbooks. This is Egypt at its darkest. And if you think you know their story, think again. Before we dive in, don't forget to subscribe if you love exploring the shadows of history. Because today, we're stepping into a world of brutal justice you were never meant to see. But this was only the beginning. To understand Egypt's punishments, we must first understand their world. The Egyptians did not see crime as a violation of man-made law. To them, every theft, every betrayal, every act of violence was an assault against the divine principle of truth, balance, and cosmic order. It wasn't just about breaking rules. It was about unraveling the fabric of existence itself. In their eyes, the Nile was life, the pharaoh was divine authority, and law was not a human invention, it was the will of the gods. The king, believed to be the earthly embodiment of Horus, wasn't simply a ruler, he was the guardian of Mat. To commit a crime under his reign was not to defy him, it was to challenge the gods who stood behind him. Records carved into limestone tablets and papyrus scrolls reveal a strict system of courts, scribes, and officials. Local councils of elders judged smaller disputes, but the most serious crimes, murder, theft of temple property, treason, were brought directly before the pharaoh himself, or his appointed viziers. And what were these crimes that brought about Egypt's wrath? Tomb robbing, a violation not only of property but of the eternal soul. Blasphemy against the gods, spoken or carved, an insult written into eternity. Rebellion against the pharaoh, seen as rebellion against divine order. For such acts, ordinary fines or imprisonment would never be enough. These were not personal insults, they were cosmic disruptions, and the punishment had to match the scale of the crime. Egypt's early law codes reveal a chilling philosophy. It wasn't about justice as we know it today. It was about restoration. Restoration of fear, restoration of order, restoration of Mat. But how exactly did this restoration manifest? How did a society that built monuments to eternity enforce its laws in ways so temporary and yet so terrifying? The answer lies in their first great escalations of punishment. The earliest Egyptian punishments were brutal, not just in execution, but in theater. They weren't meant to be hidden in dungeons, they were staged for society to witness. One of the most feared crimes in the Old Kingdom was tomb robbery. To steal from the resting place of the dead was to rob a soul of its afterlife, a crime seen as worse than murder itself. The punishment. Inscriptions suggest that robbers were often impaled, hoisted on sharp wooden stakes, and left for days under the burning Egyptian sun. The desert became their execution ground, and their body, a warning for lesser crimes. The Egyptians devised punishments that marked the body forever. Thieves could have their hands chopped off. Scribes accused of forgery might have their tongues removed, and repeat offenders were sometimes branded with hot irons. Imagine the sight: smoke rising, flesh searing, the crowd silent as the smell of burning skin spread through the air. This wasn't just justice, it was memory carved into the body itself. And yet, even these acts were only the surface. Egyptians believed punishment carried into eternity. A blasphemer's name could be erased from monuments, what they called damnatio memoria, a second death far worse than execution. For to erase a man's name was to deny him existence in the afterlife. It wasn't about making one man suffer, it was about making all who watched fear. It wasn't just a punishment, it was a message. But as Egyptian society grew wealthier, as kings demanded bigger temples and larger armies, the punishments escalated further. What had once been mere branding and mutilation would soon evolve into spectacles of terror designed to break not just the body, but the spirit of entire communities. And the first glimpse of this comes in the main spectacle of Egyptian punishment, where cruelty became ritual, and ritual became performance. By the height of the Middle and New Kingdoms, Egypt had transformed its punishments into spectacles that were equal parts legal sentence, divine ritual, and public theater. What had once been simple mutilations evolved into punishments so extravagant that they left a mark not only on the guilty but on the collective psyche of the nation. Take the case of rebellion. For those who dared rise against Pharaoh's divine authority, execution was not swift. Some were burned alive, a fate Egyptians considered among the worst possible deaths. Fire did not just destroy the body, It was believed to destroy the soul, preventing it from reaching the afterlife. In a culture obsessed with eternity, this was the ultimate erasure. Other rebels were subjected to crushing, forced beneath heavy stones until their bones gave way. In rare but terrifying cases, criminals were ordered to be buried alive in sand, their heads protruding as vultures circled above, until thirst, heat, or scavenging animals finished what the court had begun. For the crime of blasphemy against the gods, some faced dismemberment, limbs cut from the body, scattered across the desert, denying the dead the wholeness needed to enter the afterlife. To the Egyptian mind, mutilation was not just pen, it was spiritual annihilation. The Egyptians even turned punishment into ritualized humiliation. In scenes carved into temple reliefs, defeated enemies and criminals are shown forced to kneel, bound and beaten before the pharaoh, while their families watched. The execution ground became a stage, and Pharaoh the star of a deadly performance that reaffirmed divine power before the masses. Numbers etched into papyri revealed that these were not isolated acts. Under Ramesses III, records from the harem conspiracy trial tell us that dozens of accused plotters, nobles, guards, even royal wives were forced to commit suicide, while others were burned alive. The message was clear: no one, not even royalty, was safe from Pharaoh's wrath. And yet, Egypt's punishments didn't stop at physical destruction. They extended into the realm of legacy. Names of traitors were chiseled off monuments. Tombs were desecrated. Records show that one Queen I, a conspirator in the royal harem plot, was condemned to such obliteration that her very existence was scrubbed from the memory of Egypt. To the Egyptians, this was worse than death, to be forgotten forever. It wasn't punishment. It was annihilation. It wasn't justice. It was theater. And the actors who directed this cruel theater, pharaohs and rulers whose iron grip turned the machinery of justice into instruments of fear. But who were these men and women behind Egypt's darkest laws, and what personal desires, fears, and obsessions drove them to invent such punishments? Behind every punishment was not just a court, it was a ruler. And in ancient Egypt, rulers weren't just kings, they were gods on earth. Their punishments carried the weight of heaven itself. One name echoes through Egypt's darkest halls: Ramesses III, known as the last great warrior pharaoh. His reign was marked by the infamous harem conspiracy. Court records detail how the story of Egypt's brutal punishments cannot be told without first stepping back into the sacred framework of their world. For the Egyptians, crime was never simply a matter between one man and another. It was not theft against a neighbor or an insult hurled at a rival. It was, at its heart, an attack on the very order of the universe, a violation of Mat, the cosmic principle of truth, justice, and balance. To grasp this, we must understand how Egypt viewed existence itself. The Nile, flowing endlessly from the south to the north, brought life to a desert land that should have been barren. Its flooding was not random, it was divine harmony. The rising and setting of the sun, daily and eternal, was not just a cycle, it was proof of Mat. In this fragile order, every action had cosmic weight. A man stealing bread from a granary was not simply hungry, he was creating chaos. A corrupt scribe altering temple records was not merely dishonest, he was unbalancing eternity. The role of Pharaoh, therefore, was not just to govern, but to embody Mat. He was Nesebit, king of Upper and Lower Egypt, but also the earthly vessel of Horus, chosen son of the gods. His judgments were seen as divine decrees. If he condemned a man, it was not royal opinion, it was heavenly law. To rebel against Pharaoh was to rebel against Isis and Osiris themselves. Egypt's earliest courts reflected this fusion of religion and law. Local councils of elders and scribes heard smaller disputes, fights over land, theft of livestock, questions of inheritance. Their tools were simple: testimony, written records, the word of respected men. But when cases escalated, when temples were robbed, when murder struck, when treason was whispered, it was Pharaoh's viziers and high officials who presided. These trials were often held in open courtyards, watched by scribes who carefully recorded every word onto papyrus, knowing that a man's eternal fate might depend on a single phrase. The punishments recorded in these early texts reveal much about Egyptian priorities. Tomb robbery, for example, was regarded with unparalleled severity. Why? Because in Egypt, a tomb was not simply a grave, it was the gateway to immortality. To rob a tomb was to rob a soul of eternity itself. Ancient trial records from the Valley of the Kings detail shocking sentences. Robbers stripped, beaten, and executed by their bodies were left as warnings in the desert sun, not hidden, but displayed. The message was clear: disturb the dead, and you will join them denied of peace forever. Other crimes revealed subtler fears. Forgery, altering a temple record or forging a legal decree, was punished with the removal of the tongue or the severing of a hand. To falsify words was to corrupt Mat itself, and so the offending organ had to be destroyed. Blasphemy against the gods could mean public beatings or exile into the desert, a slow death under the relentless sun. In some cases, names were ordered erased from monuments, a punishment known later as damnatio. This was no small matter. To erase a man's name was to erase his existence in the afterlife. Imagine not only stripped of life but stripped of memory itself, doomed to vanish as though you had never lived, even in small crimes. The logic of fear and symbolism was present. A thief caught stealing grain might have his ears or nose cut off, marking him permanently as a betrayer of trust. Mutilation served two purposes. It punished the criminal, and it warned the community. A man without a nose was a walking reminder of the pharaoh's power, a breathing signpost that fear was the foundation of order. Religion bled into punishment at every turn. The goddess Mat herself was depicted as a woman with an ostrich feather atop her head, and at the final judgment, every soul was said to stand before Osiris, its heart weighed against Mat's feather. If the heart was heavy with sin, it was devoured by Amethyst, a crocodile-headed demon ending the soul forever. This belief translated into real-world law. Punishment in life foreshadowed punishment in death. Egyptians saw no separation between the two. Architecture and space also reinforced this reality. Picture a temple courtyard, towering sandstone columns carved with lotus and papyrus motifs, their hieroglyphs proclaiming the pharaoh's victories. In one corner, scribes bent over papyrus scrolls, recording testimony. Guards stood with staffs and spears, and in the center, before the image of a god or the statue of Pharaoh himself, the accused knelt. The weight of the scene was psychological. You were not judged by men, you were judged by eternity. So when a man was whipped, branded, mutilated, or sentenced to death, it was not explained as cruelty. It was explained as balance. Mat had been disrupted, and now Mat had to be restored. What we might call punishment, they called correction. What we might call justice, they believed was survival. But as Egypt's wealth and ambition grew, so too did the scale of its punishments. What began as symbolic mutilations and erasures would evolve into spectacles of terror, designed not just to restore Marat, but to engrave fear into the hearts of all who watched. And it is in this escalation that we begin to see Egypt's punishments transform into performances. Acts of ritual cruelty that shocked even their ancient neighbors. Even his closest family turned against him. His wives, high officials, and palace servants plotted his assassination. When the conspiracy was exposed, the trials that followed became a chilling display of royal vengeance. Nobles were forced to slit their own throats. Others were burned alive, their ashes scattered, their names erased. It wasn't only justice, it was Pharaoh proving that betrayal against him was betrayal against the gods. Another figure tied to cruel justice was Akhenaten, the heretic king. Though remembered for his radical religious revolution forcing Egypt to abandon centuries of worship of Amun in favor of Aten, the backlash against him came with equally radical punishments. Priests who resisted saw their temples desecrated, their sacred names struck from stone. After Akhenaten's death, vengeance reversed. His own memory was damned. His statue smashed, his body possibly mutilated posthumously as punishment from those who believed he had broken Mat itself. In Egypt, even kings could face punishment beyond death. Then came Horemheb, a general turned pharaoh after the chaos of Akhenaten's reign. Determined to restore order, he introduced some of the harshest legal reforms in Egyptian history. Surviving inscriptions of the Great Edict of Horemheb describe punishments for corrupt officials, nose-cutting, exile, beatings, and in extreme cases, death. Corruption wasn't simply a crime against the people, it was a betrayal of the god's order. Horemheb's Egypt became a kingdom of fear, where one accusation could mean mutilation or worse. Even female figures were not immune from these spectacles. Queen Tai, implicated in the harem conspiracy, was condemned not just in life but in death. Her tomb was desecrated, her name erased, her memory damned. Egypt's cruelty did not discriminate by gender or status, it was total. It was merciless, it was eternal. And yet, there was always a paradox. These rulers, who claimed to embody divine harmony, used disharmony, terror, mutilation, erasure as their tools. Their power was built not only on gold and monuments, but on punishments so shocking they ensured obedience through generations. But pharaohs were not just judges, they were storytellers, and some of their darkest punishments took on a theatrical, almost mythical dimension. Acts so grotesque, they blurred the line between ritual and nightmare. And this is where Egypt's justice turns into myth, where cruelty becomes legend, and legend becomes propaganda. If Egypt's punishments were theater, then its myths were the script. Every grotesque act was framed not just as law, but as divine justice. One chilling example comes from punishments tied to the myth of Osiris, the god who was murdered and dismembered by his jealous brother, Set. Priests and rulers used this myth as a symbolic justification for dismemberment. When criminals were cut into pieces, it was said they mirrored Set's crime. Their fate was not just punishment, it was a reenactment of cosmic betrayal, sealing their souls as enemies of Mat. Another legend-infused punishment was feeding criminals to animals. Lions, sacred in some myths, and crocodiles, feared as incarnations of chaos, were sometimes invoked in judicial rituals. Though not daily practice, records and stories suggest that condemned men were cast into the Nile, where crocodiles, symbols of the god Sobek, were believed to devour not only their flesh but their chance at rebirth. There are even accounts of ritual hangings, where the condemned were strung up in temple courtyards, their deaths turned into a sacred act for the gods. To hang was not just to suffocate, it was to be displayed between earth and sky, denied both burial below and ascension above. The grotesque was not always physical. Egyptians believed words carried divine weight, so erasure of a name, chiseling it out from monuments, papyri, tomb walls was considered one of the cruelest punishments. Imagine an entire existence obliterated. No prayers, no offerings, no memory. To Egyptians, this was a second death, worse than the first. And then there were myths used for propaganda. Pharaohs were often depicted smiting their enemies in temple reliefs, thousands shown kneeling before his mace or bound beneath his feet. These were not literal events, but exaggerated theater, carved into eternity. It wasn't about truth, it was about fear. Generations would look upon those walls and know disobedience meant destruction. These punishments were never random. They were carefully choreographed rituals, drawing from myth to turn cruelty into cosmic justice. To the Egyptian mind, it wasn't grotesque, it was sacred. But not everyone agreed. As the centuries passed, voices began to rise against the excess. Philosophers, poets, and even officials started to question the cost of such cruelty, both moral and economic. And so begins the decline, when punishment was no longer seen as balance, but as brutality. As centuries passed, the spectacle of Egypt's punishments began to reveal its cracks. The very rituals meant to enforce order started to look like chaos themselves. By the late period, scribes and poets quietly questioned the morality of these acts. Writings preserved on papyrus suggest murmurs of dissent. Is this mat, or is this cruelty? Philosophers wondered if justice could survive in a system built on mutilation and fear. Economically, the cost was staggering. Public executions, elaborate trials, and the resources needed to stage punishments drained the state. Priests and bureaucrats complained that temples were robbed not just by criminals, but by the endless expenditure of pharaohs trying to maintain control through blood and terror. Even ordinary Egyptians grew uneasy. Tomb robbery trials reveal that many citizens pitied the condemned. Whispered rumors said that brutal punishments could anger the gods rather than please them, turning justice into imbalance. And as foreign powers, as Persians, Greeks, began to invade and dominate Egypt, their rulers mocked the old ways. They saw Egypt's punishments as archaic, barbaric, and wasteful. Slowly, Egyptian justice began to soften, influenced by new laws and foreign systems of governance. What had once been an unquestioned truth that cruelty preserved mat was now fragile, contested. The fear that had held the people together began to fade, and with it, the aura of Pharaoh's divine authority. But even as Egypt's punishments declined, their legacy endured, etched in stone, whispered in myths, and carried into the chronicles of history. The sands of Egypt have buried countless secrets, but one truth remains: behind the glory of pyramids and the wisdom of hieroglyphs lay a justice system soaked in fear. To break mat was to risk not just your life, but your eternity. From hands severed in the marketplace to rebels burned alive, from names erased in stone to bodies fed to the Nile, Egypt's punishments remind us that power often wears the mask of justice. What they called order, we might call terror. What they believed was balance, we might see as cruelty. It wasn't just about criminals, it was about control. Every execution was a stage play. Every mutilation was a message. Every erasure was proof that Pharaoh's hand reached beyond death itself. And yet, in these brutalities lies a paradox. A civilization that gave us medicine, mathematics, and monuments also gave us some of history's darkest rituals of punishment. Their brilliance and their brutality coexisted, forever carved into the same walls of stone. So when we admire the timeless temples, the serene statues, the golden masks, we must also remember the shadows that kept that order in place. Egypt's greatness was not built on harmony alone, it was built on fear. Don't forget to subscribe if you want more journeys into the darker corners of history. And tell me, which punishment do you think revealed the darkest soul of ancient Egypt? Was it the mutilations, the erasures, or the cruelty that reached into the afterlife itself? Let me know in the comments below.